Harold Thompson's hands trembled as he held the unfamiliar tube of lubricant found in his wife's bag. 40 years of marriage, and suddenly, everything he thought he knew felt like a lie. The evening sun cast long shadows across his meticulously organized desk, highlighting the family photos that now seemed to mock him with their frozen smiles. A sob caught in his throat, surprising him with its force. Engineers didn't cry. They analyzed, they solved problems. But what solution existed for discovering your wife of 4 decades might be sharing herself with another man? Has betrayal ever blindsided you? Share your story below, like if this strikes a familiar chord. Follow for Harold's journey from heartbreak to healing. The grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from Evelyn's parents, ticked away, each sound a reminder of time invested in a relationship now balanced on a knife's edge. Harold removed his reading glasses, carefully folding them as tears blurred his vision. In his workshop, he could fix anything with the right tools and patience. But this broken trust felt beyond repair, like a bridge with compromised foundations. As the first tear fell onto his desk calendar, Harold Thompson faced the hardest structural analysis of his life, determining if anything remained worth saving. Harold Thompson settled into his leather office chair, the one that had witnessed 40 years of decisions both mundane and life-altering. The evening light filtered through half-drawn blinds, casting long shadows across his meticulously organized desk. He reached for Evelyn's handbag. She'd asked him to fetch her reading glasses while she prepared dinner. His weathered engineer's hands, calloused from decades of precision work, hesitated at the unfamiliar weight. Something wasn't right. His fingers brushed against plastic, smooth and out of place among the familiar contents. Harold extracted the tube, squinting at the label in the fading light. Men's lubricant. His mind, trained by years of analyzing structural integrity and material tolerances, immediately began calculating possibilities, each less comforting than the last. The tube felt cold against his palm, at odds with the sudden heat rising in his chest. "Not Evelyn," he whispered, his voice catching on her name. A memory surfaced, Evelyn smiling over candlelight last month, mentioning her rejuvenating yoga classes with that young instructor. The pieces clicked into place with the terrible precision of a mathematical equation solving itself. The grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from her parents, ticked loudly in the silence, marking time that suddenly seemed to stretch behind him like a fool's journey. His vision blurred as tears welled up, the first he'd shed since his mother's funeral 12 years ago. Harold removed his reading glasses carefully, folding them with the deliberate movements that had defined his professional life, even as his personal world began to crumble. His gaze drifted to the silver-framed photo on his desk, their 30th anniversary celebration, surrounded by family. Sarah stood beaming beside her mother, praising Evelyn's renewed energy in recent months. A single tear dropped onto the glass, distorting the smiling faces looking back at him. He wiped it away with his thumb, leaving a smudge that caught his attention. An engineer notices discrepancies. Always has. Harold placed the tube back exactly as he'd found it, his mind already shifting from shock to analysis. The retirement accounts, the unusual withdrawals he'd noticed last month but hadn't questioned, the late nights with the girls, his engineer's mind, trained to identify patterns and structural weaknesses, began assembling evidence he'd overlooked. A soft knock at the office door startled him. He quickly returned the bag to its place, wiping his eyes with the handkerchief Evelyn had monogrammed for their anniversary. "Dad, Mom says dinner's ready," Sarah called through the door. Harold cleared his throat. "Be right there, honey." His voice steadier than he felt. The doorknob turned slightly. Friend or foe? In his 40 years of marriage, he'd never before had to ask that question. Harold's legs felt strangely unsteady as he rose from his chair. He slipped the handkerchief into his pocket, composing his features into what he hoped resembled normalcy. The reflection in his office window showed a man he barely recognized, eyes reddened, mouth set in an unfamiliar tight line. He quickly averted his gaze. "Coming, Sarah?" he called, his voice steadier now. The engineer in him, the man who'd spent decades solving complex structural problems, was already compartmentalizing, creating mental spaces for evidence, analysis, and the searing pain he couldn't yet fully acknowledge. Dinner passed in a blur. Harold found himself nodding at appropriate intervals, lifting his fork mechanically while his mind replayed moments from recent months. Evelyn's new yoga schedule, her subtle withdrawal from their evening routines, the perfume he didn't recognize, small anomalies he'd dismissed but that now aligned with terrible precision. "Earth to Dad," Sarah laughed, pulling him back to the present. "I asked if you'd had a chance to look at that retirement cruise brochure I brought over." "Just been busy with some projects in the workshop," he replied, forcing a smile. The retirement cruise they'd planned for years. The one Evelyn had recently suggested they postpone. For what? For whom? After dinner, Harold retreated to his study under the pretense of checking emails. Instead, he opened their joint account statement on his laptop. The blue light illuminated his face as he methodically scrolled through transactions, a cold knot forming in his stomach. 3 consecutive Friday withdrawals coincided precisely with Evelyn's yoga classes. The engineer in him admired the pattern's consistency, even as the husband in him felt his world tilting sideways. He reached for the phone, thinking to call Frank, his colleague of 30 years, a confidant who might make sense of the insensible. His finger hovered over the number, then retreated. What would he say? My wife of 40 years might be. He couldn't even complete the thought. The phone slipped from his hand, landing with a dull thud on the desk blotter. Harold's shoulders sagged as a fresh wave of tears threatened. He swallowed hard against them. Engineers didn't cry. They analyzed. They fixed things. He pulled open his desk drawer, intending to retrieve his reading glasses case, only to find it locked. Strange. He never locked this drawer. Trying the key from his chain produced no movement in the mechanism. Another anomaly. Another data point in a pattern he was beginning to wish he couldn't see. Outside his study, he heard Evelyn's familiar footsteps approaching. Harold quickly closed the laptop, the financial evidence disappearing from view, but not from his methodical mind. The doorknob turned, and he straightened his shoulders. "Harold? Everything all right?" Evelyn's voice carried a note he couldn't quite identify. Concern? Guilt? After 40 years, he'd thought he knew every inflection of her voice. Now, he wondered if he'd ever known her at all. Morning light streamed through the garden windows as Harold sat alone on the weathered bench he'd built when Sarah was just a child. The roses Evelyn had planted decades ago formed a fragrant backdrop to his solitude, their beauty now a cruel counterpoint to his inner turmoil. He'd barely slept, lying motionless beside his wife, listening to her familiar breathing and wondering how something so constant could suddenly feel like a stranger's presence. In his hand, he held a small notebook, an engineer's habit, documenting specifications and measurements throughout his career. Now it contained different notations, dates, times, discrepancies, the yoga classes, the withdrawals, the locked drawer, the unfamiliar lubricant, each entry written in his precise hand. emotion contained within the boundaries of black ink on white paper. "It doesn't make sense," he whispered, his voice startling a nearby bird into flight. But it did make sense. That was the problem. The evidence formed a pattern too consistent to ignore. Harold flipped back through his notes, finding the business card he'd discovered months ago and dismissed. MW Services, with only a phone number. Marcus Winters, the yoga instructor whose name Evelyn mentioned with increasing frequency. A gust of wind ruffled the pages, and Harold's vision blurred with unexpected tears. He removed his glasses, pressing the heel of his hand against his eyes. In all their years together, he'd never once questioned Evelyn's fidelity. Even now, some part of him resisted the conclusion his analytical mind had already reached. The distant chime of the grandfather clock reached him, marking another hour in a life suddenly unrecognizable. 9 chimes. Evelyn would be leaving for her special yoga session in 30 minutes. The thought propelled him to his feet with sudden resolve. Engineers didn't just analyze problems, they solved them. Harold closed his notebook with a decisive snap. His workshop beckoned, a sanctuary of order and purpose where solutions could be found through precise application of knowledge. Not confrontation, not yet. First, evidence. Concrete, indisputable evidence that even Sarah, who'd looked at him with such skepticism when he'd hinted at his concerns, couldn't dismiss. He made his way across the garden, steps growing steadier with each stride. The man who'd spent his life ensuring bridges wouldn't collapse and buildings wouldn't fail knew something about structural integrity, about testing for weaknesses, about applying pressure at precisely the right point. At the workshop door, Harold paused, his hand on the familiar worn handle. Through the window, he could see his tools arranged in perfect order on pegboard walls, each one with a purpose, each one in its place. Unlike his life, which had been upended in the space of 24 hours. A movement at the kitchen window caught his eye. Evelyn, phone pressed to her ear, speaking animatedly with a smile he once believed was reserved for him. The sight solidified his resolve. As he pushed open the workshop door, a shadow moved at the edge of his vision. Harold turned sharply, heart racing, but saw only the neighbor's cat slinking along the fence line. He released a slow breath. For a man whose career had been built on certainty and precision, he suddenly felt surrounded by shadows and unknowns. With steady hands belying his inner turmoil, Harold reached for his keys. It was time to test some theories. The emergency room's fluorescent lights cast a harsh, unforgiving glow that made Harold feel exposed as he pushed through the sliding doors. The 2 a.m. call had jolted him from fitful sleep, a nurse explaining that his wife had requested his presence. No details provided, just urgency in the calm professional voice. Harold's heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the reception desk, fear momentarily overshadowing his suspicions. Had there been an accident? Was Evelyn hurt? "Thompson," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "My wife, Evelyn Thompson, was brought in." The nurse's expression shifted subtly. Not concern, but something else. Discomfort? Embarrassment? "Yes, Mr. Thompson. Your wife is in exam room 3. The doctor is with her now." The corridor seemed to elongate as Harold walked, each step bringing him closer to a truth he both sought and dreaded. Outside room 3, he paused, hearing muffled voices. Evelyn's, rising in distress, and a man's responding in low, pained tones. Harold pushed the door open. The scene before him froze time. Evelyn, perched on the exam table, her face flushed with embarrassment rather than illness. Beside her, a younger man with a yoga instructor's physique, wearing hospital scrubs that had clearly replaced his own clothes. Both looked up at Harold's entrance, twin expressions of shock and guilt confirming every suspicion his methodical mind had assembled. "Harold," Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her throat. I didn't expect you so quickly." The younger man, Marcus, Harold presumed, winced as he shifted position. His discomfort went beyond embarrassment, Harold noted clinically. The industrial adhesive had performed exactly as its chemical properties suggested it would. "Mr. Thompson," the doctor said, entering from behind. "I'm Dr. Bennett. There's been an unusual situation. Your wife and Mr. Winters here have experienced a rather uncomfortable adhesive reaction during—" She paused, professional decorum battling with clinical necessity. "Intimate contact." Harold nodded, the engineer in him appreciating the precision of his solution, even as the husband in him felt something tear loose inside his chest. "I see. It's not what you think," Evelyn began, the cliché falling flat in the sterile room. "I think it's exactly what it appears to be," Harold replied, his voice betraying nothing of the rage and grief battling within him. He turned to the doctor. "What treatment do they need?" While the doctor explained the solvent procedure and aftercare, Harold's gaze fell on Marcus's belongings, hastily piled on a nearby chair. A wallet lay open, a business card visible. M.W. Services, with the same phone number he'd noted in his book. Beside it, a phone screen periodically lit up with incoming texts, female names flashing in notification previews. A pattern, clear as any engineering diagram. "Harold, please." Evelyn's voice cracked, tears welling in her eyes. "We need to talk." For a moment, Harold stood motionless, decades of marriage pressing against his resolve. Then he straightened his shoulders, the action as automatic as checking measurements twice. "Yes, we do," he agreed, his tone measured. "But first, I'd like to speak with the doctor privately." In the hallway's relative privacy, Harold felt his composure finally crack. He leaned against the wall, one hand pressed to his mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. The nurse passing by pretended not to notice, offering the small mercy of looking away from his breakdown. 3 deep breaths later, an engineer's trick for steadying hands during delicate work, Harold squared his shoulders and approached the doctor again. "I'd like all the paperwork regarding this incident," he said quietly, "and I'd appreciate a detailed medical report. Evidence. Documentation. The foundation for whatever structure would replace 40 years of what he now realized had been built on shifting sand. When he re-entered the room, clipboard in hand, both Evelyn and Marcus fell silent. Harold didn't recognize the man who spoke with his voice, calm and measured. "I think it's time we discussed the withdrawals from our accounts, Evelyn. The ones that coincide with your yoga sessions." Marcus's eyes darted to Evelyn, a silent exchange that spoke volumes. Harold hadn't survived decades in a detail-oriented profession without learning to read subtle signals. "Other women should know about your services, Mr. Winters," Harold continued, gesturing toward the phone still lighting up with messages. "I wonder if they've also experienced financial adhesion." For the first time since entering the hospital, Harold felt something besides pain. The cold satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed, a problem identified. Now, it was simply a matter of applying the correct solution. The bank's polished marble floor reflected Harold's solitary figure as he waited in the manager's office. 3 days had passed since the hospital incident. 3 days of stilted conversations and separate bedrooms, of Evelyn's tearful explanations that somehow never addressed the financial discrepancies he'd discovered. Mr. Thompson, the manager, Patricia Wilson, entered with a portfolio tucked under her arm. They'd known each other for 15 years. She'd helped them set up Sarah's college fund, their retirement accounts. "I've pulled all the records you requested." "Thank you, Patricia." Harold's voice sounded hollow, even to his own ears. "I appreciate your discretion." She nodded, professional yet sympathetic. "Of course, 30 years in banking, and I've seen—" She paused, then simply spread the documents on the desk. Some things were better left unsaid. The evidence lay before him in black and white. Systematic withdrawals totaling nearly $20,000 over the past 8 months. Each authorization bore Evelyn's signature, unmistakable after 40 years of Christmas cards and permission slips. "These are all from the joint retirement account," Patricia confirmed, pointing to a highlighted column, "the one established for your post-career travel plans." The cruise brochures on their coffee table, the European itineraries Evelyn had helped select, the future they'd planned together, diminishing with each withdrawal. "Would you like some coffee, Harold?" Patricia asked gently, noticing his unblinking stare at the documents. "No, thank you." Engineers dealt in facts, and the facts were clear. "I'd like to discuss securing my remaining assets." An hour later, Harold sat in his car in the bank parking lot, new account documents in his briefcase, the engine idle but going nowhere, much like his life. The rain that had threatened all morning finally began, drops streaking down the windshield, obscuring the world outside. He reached for his phone, scrolling to Sarah's number. His daughter needed to know what was happening before Evelyn shaped the narrative. His finger hovered over the call button, then pressed. "Dad, everything okay?" Sarah's voice, warm and concerned, nearly broke his composure. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about something important, about your mother and me." "What's wrong? You sound terrible." Harold took a deep breath. "I've discovered your mother has been having an affair with her yoga instructor, and she's taken a substantial amount of money from our retirement accounts." The silence stretched so long, Harold checked to see if the call had dropped. "Dad," Sarah's voice returned, cooler now. That's a very serious accusation." "It's not an accusation, it's a fact. They were admitted to the emergency room 3 nights ago when—" "Stop, please," Sarah cut him off. "Mom already called me. She said you've been acting paranoid lately, making strange claims." "She's worried about you." The rain fell harder, drumming against the car roof. "She told you I was paranoid?" "She said you've been under stress since retirement, that you're having trouble adjusting, that you've been checking her phone, following her. Dad, she's scared." Harold's grip tightened on the phone. "Did she mention the hospital visit?" "She said you misinterpreted a medical situation." "Dad, I think you should talk to someone, a professional." The betrayal doubled, redoubled, not just Evelyn, but Sarah, too, his own daughter. "I have bank statements," he said, hearing the desperation in his voice. "Proof of withdrawals. The hospital records. Dad, please." Sarah's voice held that special tone reserved for difficult elderly parents, the one that said, "Poor old man, confused and making trouble. Mom suggested you might need some time to process retirement. Maybe see Dr. Feldman about anxiety medication." Harold sat in stunned silence. How quickly 40 years of reliability, of stable decision-making, of being the family rock could be rewritten. Suddenly, he was just another paranoid old man, imagining conspiracies, an embarrassment to be managed. "I'll come by this weekend," Sarah continued into his silence. "We can talk more then. I've got to go. Meeting in 5 minutes. Love you, Dad." The call ended. Harold sat motionless, the rain now a downpour that matched the storm within. A sob rose from somewhere deep, surprising him with its force. His shoulders shook as he pressed his forehead against the steering wheel, alone with a truth no one believed. In the midst of his breakdown, his phone buzzed with a text from Evelyn. "Where are you? We need milk and bread." The mundanity of it, the sheer normality pretended, broke something in Harold. He started the car with shaking hands and drove, not home, but to the park where he'd once pushed Sarah on the swings, where he and Evelyn had planned their future on sun-dappled benches. The park was empty in the rain. Harold sat on a wet bench, impervious to the discomfort, and let his tears mix with the raindrops on his face. For the first time in his methodical, measured life, he had no blueprint for what came next. Has betrayal ever blindsided you? Share your pain in the comments. Like if this stings your heart, follow for Harold's next move. Will anyone believe his truth? An elderly man walking his dog passed by, nodding in silent acknowledgement of another human's pain without intruding. In that small gesture of respect, Harold found a moment's comfort. Not everyone saw age as synonymous with irrelevance. As the rain began to ease, Harold reached into his pocket for his handkerchief. Instead, his fingers brushed against a business card he didn't recognize. He pulled it out, squinting at the unfamiliar name. Frank Wilson, private investigator. Patricia must have slipped it into his pocket during their meeting. Harold stared at the card, an engineer's mind already calculating possibilities, angles, structural supports for a life collapsing around him. Perhaps he wasn't entirely alone after all. Frank Wilson's office occupied the second floor of a modest building that had seen better decades. The detective himself matched his surroundings, weathered but solid, with observant eyes that missed nothing as Harold settled into the chair across from his cluttered desk. "Patricia speaks highly of you," Frank said, glancing at the bank statements Harold had carefully organized in a leather portfolio. "Says you're one of the most methodical men she's ever met." "I was an engineer for 42 years, Harold replied, the simple statement carrying the weight of a lifetime's precision. "Bridges don't stay up on guesswork," Frank nodded, understanding. "Neither do cases. Walk me through what you've got." For the next hour, Harold presented his evidence with the same careful attention to detail he'd once given to structural analyses. The lubricant discovery, the financial records, the hospital incident, Sarah's dismissal of his concerns. Throughout his explanation, Frank took notes without interruption, his expression revealing nothing. When Harold finished, the silence stretched between them until he wondered if he'd made another mistake. If this man, too, would see just another paranoid old retiree. "You documented all this?" Frank finally asked, tapping Harold's notebook. "Yes. Dates, times, amounts. It's what engineers do." Frank leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "Mr. Thompson." "Harold." "Harold, I've been in this business 28 years. People lie to me all day, every day. But numbers don't lie." "Patterns don't lie." He gestured to the bank statements. "And this is a pattern I've seen before." For the first time in days, Harold felt something uncurl in his chest, not relief exactly, but the profound validation of being believed. "In fact," Frank continued, reaching for a file cabinet behind him, "your Marcus Winters sounds remarkably similar to a Michael Watson I investigated 2 years ago, and a Martin Wells before that." He pulled out a manila folder, spreading photographs across the desk. Different names, same face. "Marcus." Harold's engineer's mind immediately recognized the pattern. He changes his name, but keeps the same initials. Easier to remember, Frank nodded. Targets wealthy older women, usually through wellness classes, yoga, meditation, life coaching, gets close to them, initiates affairs, then gradually siphons money, sometimes convinces them to invest in non-existent business ventures. And the women don't report him? Embarrassment. Fear of family judgment. By the time some realize what's happened, he's moved to another city, another identity. Frank tapped one of the photos. This client lost nearly $200,000 before her son noticed. Harold stared at the images, feeling a strange mixture of vindication and deepening anger. My wife took $20,000 from our retirement accounts. So far, Frank corrected. These guys are patient. They start small, build trust, then accelerate. The real question is whether your wife is a victim or a willing participant. The question Harold had been avoiding. I don't know, he admitted, the words bitter in his mouth. 40 years of marriage, and I don't know. Frank's expression softened slightly. That's not on you. Con men and women succeed because they're believable, because they make you doubt yourself instead of them. He gathered the photos back into the folder. But we can find out, and more importantly, we can stop it. How? Harold asked, sitting straighter. First, we document everything, build an airtight case, then we look for other victims locally. There will be more. These guys never stop at one. Frank reached for a legal pad. Then we approach your daughter with irrefutable evidence. Family support matters in these cases. And then, Harold pressed, then we contact authorities with a solid paper trail of financial fraud. These guys hate exposure. It ruins the con. When faced with real consequences, they typically flee, unless we've built a case strong enough that fleeing only makes things worse. For the first time since discovering the lubricant tube, Harold felt the familiar clarity of a solvable problem. Not the marriage, that lay in ruins no engineering skill could repair, but the fraud, the predator targeting vulnerable women. That was something he could help stop. I should warn you, Frank added, your wife may not thank you for this. If she's been manipulated, she'll face embarrassment. If she's complicit. He let the sentence hang. I understand. Harold's voice was steady now. But there are other potential victims to consider. And our retirement savings. Your retirement savings, Frank corrected. You need to protect what's left. Harold nodded, his engineer's mind already drafting plans, calculating contingencies. For decades, he'd built structures to withstand stress, to carry loads safely. Now, he would apply those same principles to rebuilding his life. One more thing, Frank said, pulling out a digital recorder. I need you to tell me everything again, from the beginning. Every detail you can remember, no matter how small. As Harold began his account again, he felt a peculiar sense of purpose returning. In his workshop at home, he'd always found satisfaction in fixing broken things, in making precision adjustments that restored function. Some things couldn't be fixed, his marriage, the trust shattered beyond repair, but perhaps, with the right tools and careful measurement, justice could still be engineered. Outside Frank's window, the afternoon sun broke through clouds, casting defined shadows across the desk. An engineer appreciates clear lines, definable boundaries. For the first time in days, Harold could see them forming again in his future. Harold stood before the bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie with practiced precision. The face reflected back at him seemed different somehow. Lines deeper, eyes clearer, mouth set with purpose that hadn't been there a week ago. Today wasn't just any day. Today was the culmination of 2 weeks of meticulous preparation, of evidence gathering, of building an unshakable case piece by painstaking piece. Today was the intervention. "You ready for this?" Frank's voice came from the hallway, respectfully remaining outside the bathroom, while Harold completed his ritual. "As ready as I'll ever be," Harold replied, giving the tie one final adjustment. Engineers appreciated symmetry, order, even when walking into chaos. The dining room had been transformed. Their familiar table, site of 40 years of family dinners, now resembled a conference room. Documents arranged in precise stacks, a digital recorder placed center, chairs positioned strategically, Harold at the head, Sarah and her husband to one side, space for Evelyn on the other. Frank would stand by the sideboard, a professional observer. "Sarah just texted," Frank reported as Harold emerged. "They're 10 minutes out. She's nervous but committed." The breakthrough with Sarah had come 3 days ago, when Frank had laid out the evidence with such methodical clarity that even her initial skepticism couldn't withstand it. Bank records, phone logs. Statements from 2 other victims they'd identified, both older women from the same yoga studio, both missing substantial sums, both too embarrassed to come forward until Frank had approached them privately. "I still can't believe Mom would," Sarah had whispered, tears streaming as the truth settled in. "We don't know how involved she is," Harold had reminded her, finding himself in the strange position of defending the possibility of his wife's innocence, even as her betrayal cut deeper than he'd thought possible. That's what today is about. Now Harold surveyed the dining room, checking each element one last time. Evidence. Witnesses. Support. The engineer in him appreciated the structural integrity of their approach, even as the husband in him ached at its necessity. "Marcus confirmed he's coming?" Harold asked, though he already knew the answer. Frank had ensured it, using the other victims' statements as leverage. "He'll be here," Frank nodded. "Thinks he's coming to discuss an investment opportunity with both you and Evelyn. When predators sense money, they rarely see the trap." A tear threatened at the corner of Harold's eye. He blinked it back, surprising himself. After days of emotional numbness, the prospect of resolution, however painful, brought feelings back to the surface. 40 years, he said quietly, touching the edge of their wedding photo, deliberately placed among the evidence. Was any of it real? Frank, with the wisdom of a man who'd seen humanity at its worst and occasionally at its best, simply placed a steady hand on Harold's shoulder. "That's the question only she can answer." The doorbell rang precisely on time. Sarah, always punctual like her father. Harold straightened his shoulders, adjusting his posture the way he once had before presenting engineering proposals to important clients. "Dad," Sarah embraced him tightly as she entered, her eyes already reddened. Behind her, her husband David nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the family crisis they'd been pulled into. "Is she suspicious?" Harold asked quietly. Sarah shook her head. "She thinks we're having a family financial discussion about your confusion." The word twisted her mouth with regret for ever believing such a thing. "And we are," Harold said, his voice finding strength. "Just not the kind she's expecting." They took their positions around the table, the scene set. Harold felt a strange calm settle over him. Engineers approached problems methodically, step by step, regardless of emotional complications. Today would be no different. When the doorbell rang again 15 minutes later, Harold nodded to Frank, who moved to answer it. From his seat, Harold could hear the murmur of voices. Evelyn's familiar tones, and the deeper register of Marcus Winters. The sound of that voice in his home sent a jolt of anger through him, quickly contained. Emotional reactions wouldn't serve the structural integrity of what needed to happen next. Trust shattered by someone you loved. Comment your turning point, like if you're standing with Harold, follow for the moment of truth. Will justice finally be served today? Evelyn entered the dining room first, her confident smile faltering as she took in the scene. The documents, the recorder, the solemn faces of her family. Behind her, Marcus surveyed the room with the calculating gaze of a man assessing exits. "What's all this?" Evelyn asked, her voice rising slightly. "Harold, what have you done?" Harold met his wife's eyes directly, 40 years of shared history between them. For a fleeting moment, he saw fear flicker across her face. Not the fear of being wronged, but the fear of being discovered. And in that moment, he knew. "It's time for the truth, Evelyn," Harold said, his voice steady as he gestured to the chair across from him. "All of it. Please sit down." The confrontation that would determine the rest of his life was about to begin. The silence that fell across the dining room held the weight of 4 decades, years of trust built and shattered, suspended in the moment before truth broke through. Harold watched as Evelyn's gaze darted from the organized evidence to Sarah's tear-streaked face, calculation replacing confusion in her eyes. "This is ridiculous," she finally said, making no move toward the offered chair. "I don't know what Harold's told you, but he's been behaving erratically since retirement, checking my phone, following me." "Please sit down, Mrs. Thompson," Frank interrupted, his tone professional but firm. "You too, Mr. Winters, or should I say Watson, or perhaps Wells?" Marcus stiffened, his practiced charm slipping for a fraction of a second. "I don't know what you're implying, but—" "We're not implying anything," Harold said, sliding a folder toward the empty chairs. "We're stating facts. Bank statements, hospital records, statements from Patricia Wilson at First National, and most interestingly," he opened the folder to reveal photographs, "statements from Elaine Gardner and Ruth Simmons." The names landed like physical blows. Marcus's confident posture faltered visibly. "Who are they?" Sarah asked, though she'd been briefed on the case. "2 other women from the same yoga studio," Frank explained. "Both experienced substantial financial losses after becoming involved with Mr. Winters here, both too embarrassed to come forward until now." "This is absurd," Marcus began, but Harold raised his hand, the gesture silencing the room with its quiet authority. "40 years as an engineer taught me something about structural integrity," Harold said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through, "about how to test for weaknesses, about how systems fail." He turned to Evelyn. "The withdrawals from our retirement account totaled $20,000 over 8 months. Money we saved together for 40 years. Money for the cruise you suddenly didn't want to take." Evelyn's composure cracked slightly. "Harold, and you," Harold continued, turning to Marcus, "have a pattern. Different cities, different names, same initials, same approach." He tapped the folder. "The police in Phoenix and Denver would be very interested in speaking with you." The word police hung in the air. Marcus's eyes narrowed, calculating odds, evaluating escape routes. "Mom," Sarah's voice broke the tension, thick with emotion. "Please, just tell us the truth. Were you being manipulated, or were you part of this?" The question Harold had both dreaded and needed answered. Evelyn looked from her daughter to her husband, then to Marcus, who had subtly shifted away from her, the first sign of the con man abandoning his mark. "It wasn't," she began, then stopped, seeming to recalibrate. "He made me feel young again, valued, desirable." Her eyes flicked to Harold, things I hadn't felt in years. "And the money?" Harold pressed, his heart cracking even as his voice remained steady. A long pause. Then, "It started as loans, for his business, then for emergencies." Her gaze dropped to the table. "Then it became insurance, that he wouldn't tell you about us." The confirmation Harold had suspected but hoped against struck him physically, a pain in his chest as real as any heart attack. Even Sarah gasped softly. "Blackmail," Frank clarified, his voice hard. "Investment," Marcus countered smoothly, finding his footing again. "I have documentation." "Falsified documentation," Frank interrupted. "I've seen the same paperwork with 3 different company names." He placed a hand on Harold's shoulder. "We have enough for the authorities, Harold." Marcus's confidence visibly crumbled. "Look, there's been a misunderstanding." "The money can be returned." "All of it?" Frank challenged. "From all the women? With interest?" The silence was answer enough. "I didn't know about the others," Evelyn said quietly, finally sinking into the chair. "I swear, Harold, I thought I was special to him." The engineer in Harold recognized the classic con, the same line likely fed to each woman. The husband in him felt only a hollow ache where anger should have been. "You were special to me," he said simply, "for 40 years. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes, but Harold couldn't tell if they were for the marriage she'd destroyed or the con she'd fallen for. Perhaps both. "We've contacted the authorities," Frank stated flatly. "They'll be here within the hour. Mr. Winters, I suggest you use that time to consider cooperation. The charges will be lighter if you return funds and provide information on your operation." Marcus's face hardened into something cold and calculating. His true face, Harold realized beneath the charm. "You have no proof of—" "We have everything," Harold cut him off, sliding the final document across the table. "Bank transfers from an account in Marcus's name to an offshore entity, meticulously traced by Frank's financial investigator. Engineers are thorough, Mr. Winters. We don't build on assumptions." The sound of car doors slamming outside punctuated his statement. Frank glanced out the window. That would be Detective Rivera, right on time. As the doorbell rang, Harold watched 40 years of marriage crystallize into this final moment. Across the table, Evelyn met his eyes, something like recognition passing between them, acknowledgement of an ending both had now accepted. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though whether to him or herself, Harold couldn't tell. Sarah reached across the table, taking her father's hand in a gesture of solidarity that meant more to him than she could know. In the kitchen, Frank was speaking to the arriving officers, his professional tone carrying faintly. "What happens now?" Evelyn asked, her voice small. Harold looked at his wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, and found that the answer came with surprising clarity. "Now we tell the truth, all of it, and then we move forward." As Detective Rivera entered the dining room, notepad in hand, Harold felt a weight lifting, not the pain, which remained sharp and real, but the burden of deception and doubt. In its place stood something he recognized from his years of engineering, the solid foundation of truth, upon which something new could eventually be built. 6 months had passed since the intervention. 6 months of legal proceedings, of divorce filings, of restructuring a life Harold had once thought immutable. The April evening was mild, the kind that promised summer without yet demanding it, as he settled into the porch swing he'd recently reinforced with new chains and fresh wood stain. From here, He could see the garden coming back to life after winter, not exactly as it had been before, but growing nonetheless, much like himself. The house had changed. After Evelyn moved to her sister's in Oregon, Harold had systematically reclaimed spaces, rearranging furniture, donating items that carried too many memories. His engineering mind approached the task methodically, assessing structural needs, planning improvements, implementing solutions. The most significant transformation was technological. Harold smiled as he lifted his tablet, tapping the home automation app he'd designed himself. Lights dimmed in the living room, the thermostat adjusted. Security cameras showed green status indicators around the property perimeter. At 68, he'd taught himself coding, combining it with his engineering expertise to create systems that gave him not just security, but a renewed sense of purpose. "Looking good, Dad," Sarah said, emerging from the house with 2 glasses of iced tea. She joined him on the swing, the motion gentle and rhythmic. Their relationship had deepened through the crisis, mutual support replacing the casual distance that had characterized their adult years. "The roses are coming in nicely," he observed, nodding toward Evelyn's former garden, which he'd simplified but maintained. "I meant you," Sarah corrected gently. "You're looking good, strong." Harold considered this. The betrayal had aged him initially, new lines around his eyes, a certain weariness in his posture. But recent months had brought something unexpected: renewal. His posture had straightened again. His eyes had regained focus. The man who stared back from the mirror each morning was changed but intact. "The community center called," he said, changing the subject slightly. "They want me to expand the engineering workshop for teens. Apparently, the bridge building competition was quite successful." Sarah smiled. "From what I heard, you're their favorite instructor. Who knew retirement would turn you into a teacher?" Harold hadn't known. Just as he hadn't known he could survive the collapse of a 40-year marriage, or that he would find purpose in sharing his knowledge with young people eager to learn, or that friends like Frank would become anchors in the storm. "Marcus's sentencing is next week," Sarah said carefully, watching her father's reaction. Harold nodded. The legal proceedings had been straightforward once evidence from multiple victims was consolidated. Marcus Winters, whose real name turned out to be Matthew Wilson, had ultimately accepted a plea deal, facing significant prison time for fraud, blackmail, and exploitation of vulnerable adults. "And Mom?" "Your mother made her choice," Harold said simply. The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago. Evelyn had avoided criminal charges by cooperating fully, returning what remained of the money, and providing testimony against Marcus. The court had recognized her as both participant and victim, a complexity Harold had eventually accepted. She'll find her way. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the swing creaking softly before Sarah broached the subject Harold knew was coming. "So, Diane from the community center called me. Wanted to know if you might like to join their weekend hiking group." Harold felt an unexpected warmth rise to his face. Diane Lee, the center's director, had become a friend over recent months, their conversations about engineering programs gradually extending to other topics, their coffee meetings lasting longer each time. "I told her I'd think about it," he admitted. "Dad," Sarah said, nudging his shoulder gently, "you're allowed to be happy again. You know that, right?" The question struck deeper than she perhaps intended. Happiness had seemed an impossible concept 6 months ago, when betrayal and loss had consumed his world. Yet here it was, tentatively reappearing in unexpected forms. Pride in a student's successful project, satisfaction in a well-designed home automation system, pleasure in conversation with a woman who valued his mind and experience. "I'm getting there," he acknowledged, surprising himself with the truth of it. As the evening deepened around them, Harold thought about the principles that had guided his engineering career, how structures could be stress-tested, how failure points could become reinforcement opportunities, how rebuilding often resulted in something stronger than what had stood before. He reached for the small notebook beside him, opening to his latest project sketches. The community center had an outdated electrical system. His proposed upgrades would save them considerable money while improving safety. Beside these notes were other jottings: hiking trails near the city, restaurant recommendations from Frank, the title of a book Diane had mentioned, plans, possibilities, a future taking shape. "The thing about engineering," Harold said, tracing a finger along one of his drawings, "is that you learn to build with the materials you have, not the ones you wish for." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder briefly, understanding. Later, after Sarah had gone home to her family, Harold stood in his workshop, surrounded by the tools and projects that had helped rebuild his sense of self. On the pegboard wall hung a framed certificate, his first recognition as a community volunteer, presented by Diane with a warmth that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with genuine respect. Harold ran a hand over his latest creation, a carefully crafted jewelry box for Sarah's upcoming birthday, its wood joinery precise and strong, its finish smooth under his fingertips. Inside, he'd designed a hidden compartment, accessible only if you knew exactly where to press. A small secret, but one born of skill and intention, not deception. As he closed the workshop for the night, Harold activated his security system with a simple voice command, technology and engineering serving his new life. Through the window, he could see stars emerging in the darkening sky, their patterns familiar and eternal. At 68, Harold Thompson was not the man he had expected to be. The life he had carefully constructed had collapsed and been rebuilt. Yet as he moved through his transformed home, adjusting a photograph here, checking a newly installed light fixture there, he recognized a fundamental truth that 42 years of engineering had taught him. Some things must fall before stronger versions can rise in their place. He picked up his phone, looking at the hiking group information Diane had sent. After a moment's consideration, he typed a brief response, accepting the invitation for Saturday. Engineers understood that even after structural failure, new foundations could be laid, new plans drawn, new possibilities explored, one careful step at a time. "I apologize for the error. My response was only about 400 words, not the 700 words specified in Prompt 7. Let me correct this and write a proper 700-word ending that meets the requirements. Rebuilding after the storm." Folks, we've all sat alone in that quiet moment when truth hits like a hammer to glass, haven't we? That instant when Harold found that tube of lubricant, when his world tilted sideways. It's not so different from your own crossroads moments. That catch in your throat, that first tear that surprises you with its heat. We've all been there, in one way or another, sitting in the growing darkness as the floor seems to vanish beneath us. Trust, when it breaks, doesn't make a clean sound. It fractures in stages, like ice on a pond you thought was solid. First, the small creak that raises the hair on your neck. Then the spider web of cracks spreading outward, and finally that terrible moment when you find yourself in cold water, gasping for breath. You've felt it too, I know. The betrayal might not have been a spouse's affair or stolen retirement funds, but we've all known that sinking feeling when someone we counted on proves unreliable. Those tears Harold shed in his car rain mixing with salt on his cheeks. They're familiar, aren't they? The weight on your chest that makes each breath a conscious effort. The way your hand trembles just slightly when you reach for the phone to call a friend, then set it down again because the words won't come. The sudden inability to sleep in the bed you've slept in for decades. These are the small devastations that follow betrayal. The aftershocks that sometimes hurt worse than the initial quake. But here's what I want you to remember, what Harold's story tells us. Age brings not just vulnerability, but strength forged through years of weathering storms. When Harold sat in that bank office, looking at the evidence of his wife's deception, he didn't crumble. He drew on 42 years of engineering expertise. He approached his broken life the way he'd approached every structural problem, methodically, step by step, identifying weaknesses and planning reinforcements. What I hope you take from Harold's journey is this. Your lifetime of experience isn't baggage, it's a toolbox. Every disappointment you've weathered, every challenge you've faced, they're all specialized instruments waiting to serve you when you need them most. That career you built, those children you raised, the friendships you've maintained. They've taught you skills that no young person possesses: patience, perspective, the ability to distinguish between a genuine catastrophe and a temporary setback. Remember how Harold sat on that porch swing, the chains creaking softly under his weight, stars appearing one by one as he considered his next step. That's where you'll find yourself too, in the quiet after the storm, taking stock of what remains. The home you can remake, the relationships worth salvaging, the new connections waiting to be built. Your fingers might trace old photographs like Harold's did, feeling the weight of what's been lost. But darlin', there's something powerful in knowing you can survive the losing. The hardest part, I suspect, is believing in new beginnings when you're standing in the rubble of what you thought would last forever. That moment when Harold hesitated before calling Diane about the hiking group, that's when courage shows its truest face. Not in the absence of fear, but in the trembling step forward despite it. You've taken those steps before, in ways big and small. You can take them again. The clock still ticks in the hallway. Coffee still smells like comfort on a rough morning. Grandchildren still laugh with the abandon that reminds you joy exists in the world. And you're still standing, still capable of surprising yourself with your own resilience. The tears you've shed haven't weakened you. They've carved channels for new strength to flow. Your heart, scarred as it may be, still knows how to beat, still knows how to hope. Still knows, perhaps better than it ever did in youth, how to appreciate the simple gift of a peaceful evening, a loyal friend, a problem solved through patience and persistence. When Harold finally reached for that phone, it wasn't an ending. It was simply the next blueprint being unfolded. And you've got plenty of blueprints left in you, too. Don't you ever doubt it.